Hi, my name is Zach.
And I'm Cole.
This is our podcast episode on the BC housing crisis, a topic that affects the future of the province. It's become near impossible to afford a home in BC with how bad the pricing has gotten.
A key reason for the prices of housing shooting up are inflation rates. Inflation rates can be simply described as the rate of which goods and services increase in price. The more rapidly it goes up, the harder it is to obtain these goods and the harder it is for the government to control. The housing crisis refers to rapid inflation over the past decade not only in BC but nationally.
In July of 2020, the residential average home price in Greater Vancouver was $1 million, which up to that point, the housing market was fairly stable, usually falling back to a median if it had risen to a point higher than usual. That's how a lot of markets work. We typically use that median to calculate how much inflation there is in our market. That median hadn't been moving a ton in the earlier part of the last decade, until around that point of July in 2020. In February of 2022, that residential average home price had risen to $1.35 million in a pretty consistent manner. Now, was this a normal time period? No, of course not. COVID-19 drove the market way up for a couple of reasons, and it's easiest looked at via a timeline. In the early days of the pandemic, the housing market wasn't hit very hard by a supply and demand crisis, as it doesn't really rely on imports or exports. But what it did rely on was the economic state of the population. While some people dealt with many issues due to the pandemic's effects on unemployment, some people flourished economically due to the pandemic. People that's jobs weren't halted ended up actually benefiting off the pandemic as they were spending way less, not going out. This inclined some of these wealthier people to use some of that money towards the housing market. So, in timeline format, at first, the housing market takes a hit due to a lot of people not being able to afford their mortgage payments anymore, and the government and banks bring mortgage rates down accordingly in order to help stabilize this issue. From there, the wealthier portion of the population takes advantage of the cheaper economy and begins purchasing second properties, etc. Once the pandemic and economic state of the population began to stabilize, there were now way more buyers in the market than sellers. This is where the supply and demand crisis begins. Keep in mind, there were also external sources buying in our Canadian markets, which didn't help at all. The government completely messed up by not putting regulations in place during this time period to prevent the population that lost their homes from not being able to get one back once their situation was figured out. They tried to make it easier to buy, but of course when you do that, the only people that are buying homes are the people in the position to be buying homes. I have to say, it just seems that the people regulating these prices and rates simply didn't think through how they were going to try to prevent this inevitable problem. Because, quite frankly, when the market drops, it will almost always make its way back up. They should have put regulations in place to freeze our market from foreign investors and prevent people from buying investment properties during this time period. If you want to upsize or take advantage of the dying market, that's fine. Just don't eat away at the supply of housing we have. And it feels like that could have been prevented. As the population grows, it doesn't help this issue either, as there's an increasing demand with supply shortage in the housing market. Fast forward to the present, when we take a look once again at our inflation rates, it all comes back to this supply shortage, and the government and banks kind of have their hands tied now. We really don't have a lot of room to keep building homes, and that also costs a lot of money, which our economy has already gotten so expensive. And we really don't have a lot of space to keep building, which would mean we'd have to expand and build infrastructure in other regions, which again, costs a lot of money. And depending on where we go, we could lose forestation, etc. You also can't just put caps on the price of homes. What are they going to do? Tell people they can't sell their home for over a certain price? Even if they found a way to control listing prices, is there any way to stop people from bidding over that price? It's way more difficult to try to control the market after the fact than if they were smarter in going about how to control it during the pandemic. Sure, they didn't anticipate the market climbing as it did, but I suppose that's one of the issues. They didn't think it through.
So why else is the market not fizzling out in terms of pricing? What are some of the other reasons prices are continuing to rise even after the pandemic destroyed the economy? The depleted labor market and shortages of construction materials is a huge factor. When there are shortages, costs go up because it's difficult to get a hold of the material. Rising construction costs are passed on to the homebuyers, meaning not only the cost of the land, but also the cost of the housing itself has skyrocketed. This all worsens the effect of climate change as there are more efforts to get the materials and more money is spent on transporting them out to the facilities and then to the job sites. There is an imbalance between supply and demand. At the rate of population growth in Canada, there are over 39 million people. We have not fulfilled and simply do not have the capabilities in terms of supply duties in order to fulfill the nationwide demand. We have also received a major influx of immigrants, which as it does have its positive contributions towards our society and economy, it also adds to our overpopulation crisis and might have to be addressed in a way that doesn't even have to involve slowing it, but going about it with a plan. I'll get to that in a bit.
So what steps must be taken towards solving this crisis? How can we make the prices of homes more affordable? The problem is, everything is linked like a web. You can lower the maximums on rent pricing, but then what happens to the landlords? What if the only way that they were able to afford their mortgage was having that income come in at that rate, and suddenly they can't afford their home anymore? If you lower the mortgage rates, well, we all remember what happened the last time they did that majorly. The solution actually might lie somewhere in the opposite direction of inflating that overnight rate so that our economy stops borrowing at such a constant rate, and overall, prices in various markets such as housing begins to fall. Again, the drawbacks with that are that people are likely going to suffer from this as our national and public debt is already so high, and it won't help this if you raise that rate. Also, mortgage rates would go up and might push people out of their homes, not helping our housing crisis for the time being. We don't want to push people out of their homes. We just want to make it so that everybody can afford homes. To be honest, we've gotten to the point where the issues in the BC housing market, especially in the lower mainland, are so complex that we might not be able to solve them without the domino effect destroying our economy. Do we have to look at it as a bigger picture? Maybe look at the grander sources of the problem? Should we be investing in expansion and infrastructure outside of our highly populated areas? Do we have a strong enough labor force to support that infrastructure? There's absolutely no simple fix. If there was, it would have likely been done by now. It's a complex issue that calls for a complex solution.
Stabilizing immigration will take some of the steam out of the demand. More people equals more houses. Cutting the immigration more strictly would not instantly make housing affordable, but it would slow down the growth in housing demand because of the cut of immigration numbers coming into Canada. The downside of cutting down immigration would be the potential for economic growth. The question is, are the citizens or the economy more important to the government, or is there a way to keep a balanced growth rate for the economy another way, other than bringing immigrants into our country while making the quality of life for citizens more realistic and affordable? An issue with the amount of immigrants arriving in Canada is the fact that majority of them are all coming to big cities in Canada, like Vancouver, BC, Toronto, Ontario, Montreal, Calgary, and Edmonton. All these cities already have large population numbers to begin with, and bringing mass numbers into these cities is an issue because with more people, this means we are going to need more housing. All these people are going to need jobs if they want to be able to afford a living. The challenge with this is that immigrants are increasingly taking lower skill and occupation jobs that Canadians are unwilling to do, but not all Canadians. It is a struggle for the new generation of Canadians as teens are looking for work to make some savings. The starting point for work are those lower end minimum wage paying jobs. This isn't a problem for just Canadian citizens either. With such large amounts of people coming in and settling in Canada, the more and more there are, the less work there will be for themselves too. A solution could be to direct the continuing arrival of immigrants to smaller towns and cities to disperse mass numbers. This will not only split mass numbers and the need for mass construction of housing in one area, but it will also provide work, either in agriculture or the trades work that will be needed for higher population as well. Again, more people means more housing, and if we need more housing, it means we need more construction. This would cause lots of demand for more workers in all areas that are required for building a house, such as electricians, framers, plumbers, supervisors, general laborers, roofers, and so much more. There wouldn't just be a need for more workers in the trades, but also in the healthcare services. For small cities and towns growing in population, the need for more healthcare services would grow with it.
When you look at a graphical analysis of average home pricing, BC and Ontario are substantially more expensive to live in than other provinces. In fact, BC has the highest average home price out of every province. Why is that? BC is desirable. Beautiful nature, mild weather, mountains and valleys, rivers and lakes, the ocean, warm summers and cold winters, etc. People want to live in BC. Not only that, we can blame Vancouver for a lot of issues in housing, especially in the lower mainland. The problem is, Vancouver is nearly dead on the corner of our land. So when we look at surroundings of the city, you have the ocean on the west, mountains on the north, and then after Richmond and Delta, the USA on the south. We can really only go east besides a little bit south, or you can drive a bit up the Sea to Sky Highway and you have Squamish as an option. Where are all these people employed in Vancouver going to live? We've urban sprawled so far east that we're now at the point where we've run into mountains east of the Fraser Valley as well. We're out of room for expansion. So all of these people that work in Vancouver have nowhere else to go. So the prices of homes shoot up, especially in Vancouver. Vancouver has become one of the most unreasonably priced cities for housing globally. Because of that, people that are just slightly out of range to afford a home in Vancouver are forced to buy homes in the suburbs. But that drives up the prices of homes in those cities. So then people that are just slightly out of range to afford homes in those cities are pushed to further out suburbs, which just continues the urban sprawl, while prices of homes in cities of somewhat close proximity to Vancouver skyrocket as well. According to Van City, the bank, The livable wage in Metro Vancouver is $25.68 hourly. I'm telling you right now, this wage will not allow one to afford rent living on your own, and just maybe it will allow a family afford to cram into an apartment. According to Zumper.com, the median price for a two-bedroom apartment in Vancouver is about $3,800 monthly. 55% of people currently renting a two-bedroom apartment in Vancouver are paying $3,000 to $4,500 monthly. So for a family of four, your kids are sharing a bedroom and you only have an apartment-sized square footage to live on. Two people living on a wage of $25.68 hourly are making $8,217.60 monthly. Using Numbeo.com to do a rough analysis of the cost of a family of four in Vancouver monthly and before rent costs, we can estimate that a family of four is spending about $5,737.70. So doing quick math, when we subtract the cost of living from that livable wage, we get $2,479.90 left over to pay rent, which we already established is going to be much more than that. To afford that median price, you're going to need to be making about $30 an hour. And remember, this is just to rent an apartment. On top of that, there are only a few neighborhoods in Vancouver where you can afford that, which might be areas that you wouldn't even want to raise a family. Sorry for the jabs, Hastings. Let's also keep in mind, minimum wage is $17.40. So if you don't have a semi-decently paying job, you're priced out of Vancouver instantly. Now, let's take a look at Surrey. Depending on where you're coming from, it could be over an hour drive to get to work and back if you're working in Vancouver but living in Surrey. The median price of rent in Surrey is $2,400 monthly. Using the numbers from our last calculations, that is just inside what the livable wage for a family of four is to be able to afford rent for a two-bedroom apartment. We'll also give it a little bit of a buffer as living expenses in general are cheaper in Surrey than Vancouver. But if you're working out there, you're paying more in gas, etc. Let's keep in mind, again, not every neighborhood in Surrey would allow for these costs. So to really be able to afford rent on that livable wage alone, you may need to move out to somewhere such as Abbotsford, where the median price of a two-bedroom apartment is only $1,900 monthly. But it could take you an hour and a half to 2 hours daily to get to work if you work in Vancouver. Is that realistic? Maybe for some people, but most would probably defer that option. So even someone making quote-unquote the livable wage really can't afford to have a family in Metro Vancouver. And let's not even discuss the prospect of owning your own home. There are very few people now that can seem to even get their foot in the door in the housing market. If I'm someone that lives abroad and I'm looking for a place to live, I'm taking one look at this data and crossing BC off the list. This is a major issue that the banks and the government will continue to find things to blame for. Sure, geographically, it's not an easy market to maintain. Just looking at land in general, as I've already mentioned, the demand is so high for such little supply. Now, it's housing in general that's become low in supply and now high in demand, but for BC's future, changes might be necessary. If all the young people are having to move away because they can't afford to live here, the labor force weakens and slowly the economy collapses.
So what's already being done? Canada needs more homes that the middle class can afford. That's what today's historic partnership with British Columbia is all about, said Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. The BC Builds program aims to use public land to create more housing, bring down the cost of construction, and ensure to build more homes faster so that Canadians from teachers to nurses to construction workers can afford to stay in the communities where they work. An issue I see with this is what about the lower class workers and the students who go to school with a minimum wage paying job or even no job at all? Are there going to be more affordable housing for them as well, either in or outside their school? When I think about these students and apprentices, I think of us and our generation. We are going to be moving into this life in a couple of years, and the reality of it all is we are not going to be able to afford the living costs unless you have a well-paying job, and even if that, the cost of rent in our area is through the roof, so most will just barely be able to pay their rent. Not even mentioning the cost of food, their phone bill, internet, utilities, cable, and transit. This won't be easy for us, but change will come. And it's crucial to remember that while these challenges are significant, so are those efforts being made to adjust them.
I've read a lot of articles, some even put out by the government, and it seems the main call to action is simply to build more homes. The problem is, we don't have the required infrastructure or space to support these new developments for the time being. So even though if we continue to expand, it might help in the long run, we need to start looking at different concepts of managing the housing market. Let's take a look at some more effective models. In Vienna, Austria, nearly half of the residents are living in non-profit housing owned and operated by the city. This way, the city controls the pricing and has way more control over the market. The problem here in Canada is that we're socially marginalized in the field. Some people thrive off the housing market, while others are just barely getting by. So, how much money do we have to play with? What if the government starts buying back land and housing? It's a super expensive concept because of how much has been sold over time. But what if slowly the city starts taking back its land? Sure, it's less tax money, and you'd have to be able to convince enough landowners to get on board and sell, but this could be a major step in solving the housing crisis if the government could somehow pull this off. Now, you know me. There's always going to be drawbacks. If the government starts buying properties off mass amounts of people, I doubt a lot of people moving off their properties will just pack their bags and head on out. There's still going to be a supply and demand issue. The people that are being pushed out will just now have to move on and find different housing. Will this add to the demand crisis? In theory, no, because the government will fulfill the demand when they sell elsewhere. But the government can work smarter, not harder. What if they bought the homes of offshore landowners, people that own homes that they do not reside in? This is only a small step towards taking over the market, and the government has even started putting policies in place to avoid people owning homes when they do not reside in Canada. But I think that might be the right way to go. Another problem comes in when you realize that the government and economy might not like this idea, in the sense that when you buy property from a citizen that resides in British Columbia, that money is likely going to be put back into the economy in their living expenses or the purchase of their next home. So we aren't losing money collectively. When you buy from someone that doesn't reside in Canada, we lose that money into external economies. And I really don't think there's enough offshore landowners that you could really drive the market down by doing a financial takeover. But hey, that's an area that helps us slowly solve the demand crisis. Let's go back to geographics for a second, because Canada is the second largest country in the world when it comes to landmass, so it sounds kind of wild that we're running out of space. In the Lower Mainland, this is true. To sustain our agricultural land and respect the land treaties that we have in place for nature and First Nations reconciliation, we have pretty much maximized our space in terms of developing new communities to be within proximity of Vancouver. Though, once we get into the Eastern Fraser Valley, I think that the government could buy, if they don't already own, enough land to start developing new communities. Unfortunately, it seems that might be our only solution for the time being. Build, build, build. In this case, immigrants would be important to the labor force so that we can sustain new communities, because crises in the labor force are already bad enough. Looking at healthcare alone, we barely have enough doctors and nurses to support our pre-existing communities. So, how are we going to develop new ones when the labor force in our pre-existing ones are already suffering enough? When we bring in more people, though, as Cole mentioned, we are adding to the demand crisis, which kind of defeats the purpose of developing a new community. I mean, it sucks that our labor force is so weak because we have so many people, so we can't put enough people in homes while we are in need of more people of specific skills. Little things such as doing more to promote lines of work might slowly help solve our problems. We have to look at solving the labor or housing crisis before we tackle both. But where I was going with this is that for the sake of our citizens, we might have to start sending people away to go live elsewhere, which of course is near impossible to forcefully do. And I mean, come on. I'm sure if the government had a way of kicking out people that don't help in the labor force, they would. But we have to slowly stop overpopulating the province to take away the issue. I think somehow we have to take a different major city and heavily centralize it, create a lot of opportunity and make the city a hub for work. From there, start building onwards and create a different hotspot in BC where people can start to move, but we continue to prosper as a province. The problem again comes into play with the labor force. Do we have enough skilled laborers to support another centralized city? And how much will bringing in skilled laborers hurt our population? Can somewhere like Kelowna, or a place where we've already got to start in developing a populated and opportunistic community, support expansion? There's a lot of mountains and hills, and we've already built around it quite a bit with places such as Vernon, Penticton, etc. Also, the Okanagan likes its quiet lifestyle. Would the government get enough support to go about major projects like this? How much interest would it really take away from Vancouver? These are all questions that we have to ask. So looking at the overall economic state of the province over the past decade, the pandemic completely screwed us, and we're still suffering from the effects of it. Not only did it completely mess with the workforce in ways that couldn't have been predicted, but it increased marginalism in our society, which when the government attempted to resolve that issue, only screwed us even more, which now we are slowly getting priced out of the area. Overpopulation, global trade halts due to various conflicts, and overall supply issues have led to an overly inflated economy that we can't seem to control. Every solution has a risk factor to it, but that's just how it goes in politics. You have to take those risks if you ever want to achieve change. Unfortunately, the risks that the government took over the past few years have only dug us into a deeper hole, which ironically, the solution now is to just build our way out. I don't see the labor force crisis solving itself anytime soon with that plan though. So what are we going to do? Do I have to start looking at housing out of province? Does my whole generation have to do the same? But it's crazy to me that there are still massive amounts of people moving here when we clearly don't have the room. Maybe we have to tighten our immigration policies, or at the very least, have provincial regulations so that we don't just keep pricing more people out of BC. Maybe a change in government will bring us more answers, or at least a heavier call on our government to take control, because it seems that so much damage has been done that Now, they're too scared to hurt the economy more than it already has been. It pains me to say because don't get me wrong, I can see why we can't just reverse these issues. But at the same time, I really feel like we have to take action, even if it goes against some people's wishes. This was our take on the BC housing crisis. Thank you so much for listening.